Okay, Ed, we've got not much time, and but we've had a very interesting session through the morning, ranging from Donald Trump to Australia's various regional challenges. But now you guys at Bloomberg have to make instant decisions about what's newsworthy more than most people in this room. So I just wonder what you think is going to turn up on the wire out of this.
Sure, and obviously very conscious that you and I are the two people now standing between the audience and their lunch out on the terrace. So I'll be brief. We've had such a fantastic overview of the geopolitical tensions that are sweeping through the region. Danny and the other speakers encapsulated it so succinctly. This intensifying rivalry between the two great powers. But obviously at Bloomberg, we can't go past the economics, we can't go past the market impact. So what really struck me was when Stephanie talked about how the global turbulence in the economy has really truly become real this week for Australian investors, mums and dad investors, people who are looking at their superannuation balances. I had a quick check of the numbers, and the ASX 200, our main benchmark index, that's down more than 4% since trading started on Monday morning. That's $74 billion of market value wiped off our stocks. I just think that's an incredible figure we can't go past. Also, I thought Sulin Ong gave us a really succinct overview of the impact of these tensions on the global economy as well. The fact that we are now expecting easing and very significant easing from the major central banks across the G7 and the very worrying signs of slowing global growth and even tipping into recession. Those are the standout points for me today. What about yourself, Greg?
Oh, well, we've got a bit more time to think about this at Asia Briefing. It's a monthly, you see, so we can take a bit of time to sort it out. But one phrase that's been stuck in my mind through the week's events is actually the phrase personal agency, which I think Danny Russell used down in Melbourne to try and characterise the way we've got this superpower rivalry, but we've got these two leaders who, he wouldn't probably use this term, but to me are sort of megalomaniac sort of characters who want to have a lot of power. And the question is whether they're really driving all of this by themselves or in which case, perhaps we can hope for them to move on eventually, or whether, as you listen to these sort of discussions that we've had here today, whether there's a much greater hardening of the arteries in these systems over these issues and in these two great countries and perhaps in other countries as well, and that it's not really about just personal agency is a very important factor, clearly, but maybe it's a much more concerning sort of phenomenon that we're dealing with here than just the capacity of these two leaders to do that. So I think that's an interesting thing that's been ventilated a few times. Just moving on to the sort of economic discussion, I think once again this last panel sort of dealt with this whole idea of whether oh my goodness, this isn't supposed to happen, but
that's someone asking you to hit your deadlines.
That's right. Well, yeah, no, I don't have someone doing that, unlike you, Ed. But this issue of whether the world is dividing into two zones. This was a big issue last year at this conference, and I think that. That's obviously a very worrying issue in various sectors, and there's lots of signs of that happening. But I think I'm more inclined to Martin Parkinson's idea that this is a much more complex sort of equation that we have to deal with, and that in fact what we might be really facing now is a sort of rules-based order that involves what he described as an institutional smorgasbord that we just have to learn to deal with. And so I think that is a new way of looking at this idea that there's not just going to be a completely two separate worlds, but a much more diffuse world in the middle. And I think the other issue is whether, in the case of technology, we can have arguments about standards and that is going on, but whether just the fast development of technology allows a diffusion of technology around the world and allows technological fixes in some cases. And we've seen the way technology has technology leapfrogging, which he also referred to, has gone on in some Asian countries. And so I tend to think that the outlook is much more, as I say, diffuse than simple and binary. And just the third interesting point I just observed to quickly be a bit more pessimistic, I suppose, is the way Kashmir hasn't turned up in our conversation today. It's a new event. It used to be that line of control in Kashmir used to be sometimes described as the most dangerous place in the world because of the Indian and Pakistani risk of nuclear confrontation. And, of course, the changes that India imposed just the other day are quite new, but it just shows that there's so many things going on in the world these days that you need at least an afternoon to get onto Kashmir. So that says something about the world.
Okay, one of the fun aspects of today, beyond the absolutely wonderful artwork that I've been enjoying on social media from Rocco, has been the audience polling. And we just want to quickly go through some of the results of this morning's polls. I'm not sure whether we're going to bring those back up on screen. One of the questions, China's influence is rapidly growing in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific through aid, investment and military power. Australia should push back and assert our position or accept China's rising power and try to work it out. Now, what we both found very, very interesting was we asked exactly the same question last year, and the results were markedly different. Last year, 10% of the audience said we should push back, and 90%, an overwhelming majority in the room, said that we should accept China's rising power and try to work with it. Today, we were talking about a 25%, 75% split. 25% of people, more than double last year, say we should push back and assert our position. What's going on there, Greg?
Well, I think you've seen a public reaction in Australia to both China's actions and also in response to the much more heightened media coverage of this issue in Australia in the last year. These results, with this change that we've seen between our two events here in Sydney, also reflect the quite seminal change I think we saw in the Lowy Institute poll on a couple of China questions that sort of parallel or shadow this sort of question in the poll that came out about 3 months ago. I think for the last 10 years, through all the rise and fall of relations with China, there's been a really consistent trend in the Lowy poll of relative public support, greater public support for engagement with China than I think we've had from some parts of the security establishment in Canberra, for example. But the public position seems to have aligned more with where the say the security establishment position is recently, and this trend we've seen in a very modest way seems to be going in that same direction. Very interestingly, down in Melbourne on Tuesday, when we did this poll, we had essentially a 50-50 split, which suggests that Melbourne people are harder line on this China issue than people here in this room today, which of course is at odds with the Victorian state government's position on the BRI. So I don't know what we should make of that.
Right, you looked at the second poll this morning, didn't you? And you're comparing the results there with what we had last year.
Yes, well, the poll on the five, the choice of which country is important to Australia, which we did, it also showed a interesting change, which has, I think is quite interesting. Last year, essentially, China ranked about 55-60% in that poll, and India was coming in about 20-30%. They basically chewed up the whole selection of which country is the most important country or the country presents the best opportunity for Australia. What we've seen today is a decline in support for both China and India by roughly about 25%, and a significant rise in support for Indonesia, which I think is quite a positive thing, given we've just signed the IASEP trade agreement with Indonesia, and it's about to be ratified. So I think that shows a sort of diffusion of Australian opportunities in the region, which is probably a good thing to have happening when we've got this sort of more discussion about the binary sort of world in front of us. Japan and Korea also did slightly better this time than last year. So that's an interesting development as well.
Right. We are going to go quickly now because I'm getting hungry. We're going to go live again, so do get your mobile phones out. We're going to have 2 more polls. I think that's all we've got time for. The first one, describe the impact on Australia if the US-China trade war continues to escalate. We've got 3 options there: catastrophic, limited damage, and Australia will come out unscathed.
Nobody's going for the third option.
That will bounce around. We'll let it settle down a little bit. And again, we're comparing the results of this polling with the same question we asked last year, and it will be interesting to compare.
Well, I think it's settled, and here we've seen a reversal of positions on last year, which suggests that we're much more worried about the trade tensions now that we've had, and that's probably quite a logical position to expect to change. But it's a polar opposite of last year.
Maybe that's a direct consequence of what Stephanie pointed out. That the real economic impact of all this tension is coming home to roost.
Yes.
Right. Last question then, Greg.
Okay, so now we're returning to the question which was we saw as a bit of a crowd pleaser because it was a bit provocative last year. It also got a bit of attention on social media. But now this is the question about rating how the Australian government has managed its relationship with China. You've got 5 options here, so it's quite, there's a bit of room for subtlety, unlike the more binary question we put up for trade, which reflected the sort of binary world we keep talking about. So now I can't, it's quite complicated to see the movement here. Well, okay. Well, actually, this is interesting once again.
Pretty similar to last year.
Very similar.
And
Yeah, basically, it's about the same as last year on the clumsy and inconsistent front, really. So now, this is just a small input, Richard. It's not meant to be definitive, but.
Worse or better than last year?
No, this is about the same as last year, actually.
Marginally better.
Marginally better, yeah, marginally better. But now, you should have been down in Melbourne on Tuesday, though, because down in Melbourne on Tuesday, things were much better, because...
Like Melbourne.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, the Melbourne opinion was around 50% for clumsy and inconsistent, and then there was actually 25% thought that the management of the relationship had been good. So, which is once again different to Sydney. So,
well, that was the final question, and that brings the session this morning to a close. I'd just like to thank the Asia Society again for allowing us to partner with them on today's event. The work that the Asia Society does in fostering closer ties with the region is absolutely critical, and the reasoned, intelligent voice that it has really does cut through so much of the noise in this debate. Thank you again to all of our speakers. It really has been a smorgasbord of fantastic insight that personally has spurred a lot of avenues that we'll start exploring now for stories. And I really do look forward to reading your assessment in a couple of weeks.
A couple of days.
Okay.